Welcome. We're very pleased this morning to have with us Professor Mark Lance, who is professor in both the philosophy department and the program on justice and peace at Georgetown University. He's published extensively in the areas of philosophy of language, metaphysics and epistemology, and philosophical logic, but writes as well on pragmatism, feminism, metaethics, the foundations of mathematics, anarchist theory, and applied issues of social justice activism. He's also been an activist and organizer for over 30 years, working on a wide range of issues, including working with the Truth Telling Project, which is one of the subjects he'll discuss with us today in his talk, as he explains a new approach to reparations for the effects of white supremacy in the United States. Won't you please welcome Professor Mark Lance. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here. I'm always happy to talk about things like this. As Peter said, I'm going to talk about white supremacy, but not in the sense of white supremacists. That is to say, I don't want to talk about people's psychology or actions. We're not here to talk about the Klan or White House advisors or that sort of thing. Rather, I want to talk about white supremacy as a social structure, as a set of interlocking institutions, traditions, and conditions and practices that we all participate in, regardless of our views, regardless of how nice a people we are, regardless of where we come from. So I'm going to just briefly illustrate how I think about white supremacy. And if I were to give a quick definition, I would just say the interlocking set of social conditions that make it the case that whites do better in the world. And what I'm going to illustrate that really quickly by myself, just with my own autobiography, because that's probably less offensive than talking about anyone else. But what I really want to talk about is this new project that's recently been launched of as Peter said, a different form of reparations. Okay, so I've accomplished a lot in my life. I worked really hard for all that. I did not grow up wealthy. My parents were first-generation college students. As far as I know, I've never knowingly or directly participated in any racist practices. And yet, my grandparents owned a nice house and a small farm. Black family net worth in this country is roughly 15% of white family net worth on average, and the median black family has zero net worth. And there's been several recent detailed economic studies showing that the single most important statistical indicator of one's own wealth is one's historical family wealth. Way bigger indicator than education or employment or any other thing you might come up with. If you grow up with family resources, you very, very likely will have resources yourself, and if you don't, you very likely won't. I went to a really good, almost all-white school. Black schools in Central Ohio were not nearly as good and did not support you as well, did not put you in the same networks of support, advice, and recommendations. I went to an almost all-white church, a well-supported and funded church that provided after-school sports, yet more social networks, and taught you all of those little social capital things that make a difference in getting into grad school and getting jobs. I grew up in a really nice suburban neighborhood with low crime, almost entirely white. I played in white bands and orchestras, and indeed on a chess team. As you might guess, the black schools in Central Ohio did not have as extensive a music program and did not have chess teams. My graduate school, I was lucky enough to get into one of the top graduate programs in philosophy in the world. They did not teach courses on race. I took several seminars in political philosophy. Not a single one so much as mentioned white supremacy. None raised the question of why the room was entirely white. None discussed economic justice or environmental racism or segregation. Those questions weren't censored. It wasn't like there was anyone who would have given you trouble if you did. It just simply wasn't interesting enough to merit philosophical attention at the time. One more example. I'm here today because I know Gary. I know Gary from rowing. We row together at 5:30 in the morning. We're kind of insane. And through the network of rowing, my wife and I have helped easily a half dozen young folks find jobs, make connections, get into grad school. That's a good thing to do, right? That's what nice people do. You help out the people you know through your circles. It just so happens, and quite non-accidentally, that rowing is an almost exclusively white sport. So the people we help are the people we run into. Okay, so that's the kind of what I'm trying to talk about here. It's not, none of this is to say that I'm personally guilty, but it is to say I'm personally privileged in all sorts of to me accidental, but historically quite not accidental ways. And in that sense, I want to claim that every institution in our society is shaped in its history, its status, and its practice by the history, institutions, relations, and psychological habits of white supremacy. And every one of us, whatever our views, however well we treat our black friends, however much time we devote to activism or political campaigns, contribute to that interlocking systemic structure simply by going to work, by going to school, by going to church, by helping the people in our lives. And that's what I take to be the problem. I think this is a kind of brokenness of society around race, right? It's, if you think of King's image of the beloved community as one in which we systematically live our lives in ways that make it possible for others to flourish, this is a way in which we've departed from that. I could use Christian words here, right? But I mean, it's really true. This is a brokenness in society. And furthermore, that systemic nature of this seems to me to imply that this is not a problem that's going to reduce to owing some particular amount of money to some particular group of people. It's a deep distortion of our way of life across all aspects of it. And to repair it, then, requires changing far more than can be accomplished with a check. Now, I'm not arguing against government reparations here. I think that would be awesome if the government recognized some of what we directly owe to people whose history has been harmed. But that alone isn't, I think, going to fix the problem in general. So, what I'm really here to do today is evangelize. I'm bringing you a call that comes from a wide coalition of groups. Centrally in that is the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, and COBRA. One of the coordinators of this campaign is the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Some of you may know of FOR. They've been around since the early 20th century. They were the people that did the trainings for everyone going on the freedom rides during the civil rights movement, right? So they've been around for a long time doing the hard work. And this group I've been working with called the Truth Telling Project, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Okay, and there's about a dozen other groups in there. And the call is really simple. What they're asking for every institution in America, but specifically white institutions, be these businesses, schools, activist groups, churches, community organizations, to do two things. Undertake an assessment, a self-assessment of the ways that your position is privileged by virtue of the history of white supremacy, and then make a commitment to some form of reparative work. That's it. It's called grassroots reparations, right? Because everybody can do it. Okay, so I'm going to give you two examples of what I take to be fairly productive grassroots reparations work. Neither of them are solving everything in the world, but they're little tiny efforts. So the first is this project called the Truth Telling Project. I apologize. We were supposed to bring a laptop to show you a picture of the website, and we failed. But what I'm talking about is at thetruchtellingproject.org. You can look it up and follow all this. What's the Truth Telling Project? So shortly after Mike Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri, five plus years ago, there were two people from the community, David Ragland and Corey Bush, who are both educators and activists and other things, They happen to know a lot of people in a certain network of educators, in particular people working in the field of peace and justice studies. And they called some of us. And we pulled together a group and they said, here's a thing we could do. Many of us were feeling really frustrated seeing the daily reports of police violence against black folks, not quite knowing what concretely you could do. So Dave grabbed a bunch of us, said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up a series of events where we bring family members of people who were killed by police and invite them to give their testimony to a panel of elders from the Ferguson community, unfiltered, 15, 20 minutes, explaining the effects of this violence on their lives and the way they've moved, in many cases, toward activist work as a result of it. And we did this. We paid for the families to come in, provided support, filmed these events, edited them, made a website. We built it out with questions, study questions, and additional resources and exercises. The idea is that as people tell their truths about the realities of living in communities where the police are seen as an occupying force, we heard that phrase over and over and over again, any community anywhere can take one of these testimonies, have a session, and work on ways that you can work against white supremacy, led by the voices of the people most directly affected. So just two things I want to point out about this. The work we all took on for 5 years was our professional work, right? We're teachers, we're researchers, this is what we do. But we're not normally supposed to do it for this. This isn't but we all did. We devoted a hunk of our time to doing this work. And the other important thing is that if you go through this website, you'd have to look really, really carefully to say, see my name or my face. I'm not there. And that's important because it's not, when people teach about this and learn about this, they don't need to see me. They need to see the people affected. So among the testimonies, I'll just mention, there's two things I want to mention that are in there. We also brought a group called the Babel Project, which is an amazing group. They go around the world teaching kids to use cameras and film editing software and all of that stuff to document their own lives. So they came to Ferguson, and the result, you can see this on the website, under It's Time to Listen, is a short film, 7-8 minute film, produced by the sisters and friends of Mike Brown. So these like 10 to 15-year-old girls, they shot this film, they are the ones speaking, they edited it, they did everything because, Pally and others taught them how. And it's in their own words. Another one I'll mention, because it, I think, connects so many issues, and actually someone who later became a student of mine, Brandon Anderson, gives testimony in here. Brandon's story is roughly, he dropped out of high school with his lifetime partner and joined the Army because that was where he could get a job. And this was in, I guess, the 90s. One day, while he was deployed in the Middle East, his partner was shot by the police. They wanted someone. Turned out it wasn't him. It was someone else, but they were both black men. And they shot him. And he was lying in a hospital dying. Brandon went to his commanding officer to say, gee, my partner's lying in a hospital dying, I need to take a leave to go see him, and was told, because this was the era of don't ask, don't tell, to turn in his gun, and he would expect a dishonorable discharge within the week. So that's the kind of, so there's if you're teaching that story, then you can start talking to people about intersectionality and other issues. Brandon's a success story. He eventually got to community college, went from community college to Georgetown, graduated from Georgetown, went to Ferguson, spent 3 months in Ferguson, became an organizer, is now an entrepreneur, an organizer, doing all kinds of amazing work in the world. But anyway, okay, so that was a way that I think we educators, in a very small way, tried to contribute to repair. The other example I'll give you really quickly, and then we'll stop, is my actual institution, Georgetown. Many of you probably know that it recently became public that the Georgetown Jesuits not only owned slaves, but when the Jesuit order decided that slavery was wrong, took them a while to work that out, and ordered that slaves be freed, the president, because they were facing a bit of a financial crisis, instead sold 100 and some slaves from Georgetown and paid off their debts with that. There was still a minor building named after the man who did this on campus. Students worked this out and caused trouble, complained. And the university, and I give them credit for this, they didn't take the lead on this, the students did, and some faculty, but when faced with the choice of being obstinate and on the wrong side, as many universities have, or jumping out in front of it and doing the right thing, they chose to do the right thing, I think. So there's two kinds of things Georgetown has done in response to all of this. First of all, they offered free education to all descendants of the people who were sold. Second, and this was another student initiative, they've now committed to raising $400,000 a year in the indefinite future in direct reparations to those particular people. But Georgetown's, as I was saying from the beginning, Georgetown's participation in white supremacy is not limited to some particular horrible event that happened 200 years ago. We did not have an African American Studies department at Georgetown in 2015. We didn't have a black philosopher at Georgetown in 2015. Georgetown for 100 years did not admit black students. Georgetown's labor policies for hundreds of years marginalized a largely black workforce in security and food service. Much of that's also been changed by student activism in the last few years. So to my mind, a more important and longer lasting legacy is the following set of changes. Georgetown committed to creating an African American Studies department, which they have. The first 5 people have been hired in that department. They created an institute for the study of racial justice that's hiring faculty and postdocs and more people. My department, the philosophy department, was actually, this was in the works slightly before all of this came down, but coincidentally lined up with it, committed to its next 5 junior hires being people working in the area of philosophy of race. These changes are going to transform what a university does. The kinds of questions we research, the kind of teaching we do, the kind of people we model for the students that come to Georgetown. It's going to have, I believe, just simply the number of people coming in with different interests in addition to different faces. My dear friend and recent colleague, Femi Taiwo, who works on economic imperialism and environmental racism, right? The things that weren't taught when I was in grad school. We teach them now. Students love him. He's a rock star. He's actually kind of literally a rock star because he also writes music, plays music. These things, I believe, are going to make some difference. All right, so I'm going to stop there. None of these 2 little examples, they're tiny, right? They're not transforming white supremacy in our society, but I sort of think of, the image I think of regarding white supremacy is this vast knitted blanket that's ripped and torn and damaged everywhere. And I see these as mending together 2 little threads somewhere in the corner. But there's no other way to fix a torn tapestry than to mend the threads one at a time. You can't just throw it away and build a new one because it's us, right? So that's my charge, or my call, I don't know. I would like to ask every organization that I talk to about this, if you could yourselves go through an inventory. Think about the ways that this institution has benefited from all of that history and economics and sociology, and then commit to something, whatever it is, right? I'm sure I don't know your neighborhood, but I'm sure there's black organizations that could use a place to meet once a week, or childcare, or food service. You know better than I do what you have to offer, what would be useful. First thing to do is ask. So, not put yourself in charge of it. But that's the call that's coming out from NCOBRA and other organizations, is that we all take a kind of moral inventory of our role in white supremacy and commit to something that will repair that. So I'm going to pretentiously ask you to do that. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, sorry.
That's okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. That's a lot to think about. I had sort of many ideas swirling through my own head as you presented that call to us, and indeed, as I think I've mentioned to you, we recently had a forum here in which we, in a sense, did a little bit of that inventorying by looking at the history of racial injustice here at St. John's itself through our archives, and maybe that will be a good starting off point for us. But I did have a number of questions before we open it up to the audience, and one of them actually came to mind after reading the Washington Post this morning, which in the Outlook section had a discussion of 5 myths of slavery. And in the introduction to this, it notes that only 8% of high school seniors can identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War, according to a recent Southern Poverty Law Center survey.
Wow.
And that's pretty astounding. Now, you've defined white supremacy this morning as an interlocking set of social conditions that, of course, still exists. So I actually have a two-part question. One is in your own work with students, both at the college level and perhaps at other levels, do you see this level of ignorance?
I mean, I don't. Georgetown students are not statistically representative. I mean, and in particular, the students that come to Justice and Peace Studies classes are really, really not statistically representative. So no, I mean, the kids that come to Georgetown and study with me know the causes of the Civil War and are pretty aware of these things. They're certainly not taught about the, I mean, the dimension of ignorance that I think is in some ways even more important than that is ignorance of the work on the other side, right? I mean, I'd love to see what percentage of people could tell you details about the abolitionist movement, about the Underground Railroad, about the work that went in, right? So, in my high school, we did some history class and someone said, slavery was abolished by this constitutional amendment or Abraham Lincoln. They didn't mention that there was 100 years of organizing that brought about the conditions that made that possible. I had certainly not heard of John Brown. Look him up if you don't know John Brown. The original race trader, the man who tried to foment an uprising of slaves. That history, and that history I feel like is what's crucial, because it's so easy to face these systematic problems and think, what can we do? Well, people have faced a lot worse over the history of this country and have changed a lot more. It's just a matter of breaking it down, making a plan, figuring it out, and then doing the work. And that's what I feel like, that the ability of ordinary people working together to change things is what I feel like most perniciously gets removed from people's education, though, God, 8% know about, that's horrifying.
Yeah. And I would suspect that another area of ignorance has to do with the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation, and of course you've made it quite clear in your talk how white supremacy has continued. But this article actually notes a specific type of remnant, or perhaps more than a remnant of slavery. Myth number 5, the Civil War ended slavery. I suppose one could fill in a lot under that title. This one talks about the practice of convict leasing.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if people are familiar with that. In a sense, that continues today.
Of course it does.
But it started by arresting African Americans, usually males, for often minor offenses, and then quote unquote leasing them out to plantations, farmers, whatever, to provide free labor, and many of these folks never got out of that situation,
right.
And this continued, and so. Are there other examples of that, and
Sure.
that you could expand upon?
Sure. I mean, just to fill in a bit on that, right? So, I mean, Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander have both written extensively on this history, but just a few years after. So, first of all, just remember the exception that's written into the anti-slavery amendment, right? So we shall have neither slavery nor indentured servitude, except as punishment for a crime. That's a big exception. And how big it is depends on how many crimes there are. And so, of course, across the southern states, shortly after slavery was outlawed, the rise of things like loitering laws and looking at women sideways laws and things of that sort were implemented in such a way that within 20 years, the number of blacks involuntarily working on plantations was virtually the same as it was under slavery. It was just that these were all people who had been convicted of a crime and then leased back to the plantation to work as punishment now. So you get new forms. And we don't have literal convict leasing now, but we have hundreds of thousands of convicts working for major corporations at virtually no pay, with no rules, no labor laws applying to them because they're convicts. Right now, Apple employs convict labor. Lots of people do. But also I want to say that, sort of as you trace through the sort of mechanisms by which a ruling group reproduces itself, and these are not all conscious, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, sometimes they evolve in this way, but in a lot of cases, mere habits of where we live, habits of who we talk to, economic disparity can have roughly the same effect, right? I mean, yeah, it's not exactly the same working for minimum wage at Walmart and then another job at night as being a slave, but it's not as different as it ought to be. It just isn't. And if you look internationally, of course, there's slavery in all but name in many, many parts of the world, producing the clothing and the electronic goods and mining the minerals for the electronic goods that we all use here. I mean, looking at the conditions of children mining in Africa for rare earth minerals that go into every touchscreen in the world. Those conditions are probably worse than the average condition of plantation slavery in the United States. But yeah, I mean, it's the form has changed for sure, and the victories are real victories. I don't want to say that abolition wasn't important. I think it was one of the great moments in history, but boy, it didn't fix everything.
I want to shift gears here a little bit. I was interested to read on your website that on your CV that you note that you are on at least 10 blacklists and that you have been officially declared a quote-unquote race traitor by contributors to Stormfront.org, a major white supremacist website. I wanted to ask you about that and about social media in general, and how social media has changed your activism. You've been an activist for quite some time, before the age of social media, indeed before the age of the internet. And I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, so first of all, I do think it's just useful. The best strategy for dealing with blacklists, which are essentially kind of quiet ways to constrain people and scare them into not doing things, they work through being hidden. And so I really believe, as a general strategy, that especially people that are relatively safe and relatively privileged, it's not, I mean, sometimes people like me get killed in movements, but a whole lot less than most other people. I think it's important to just be open about these things. So yeah, what was it, 15 years ago, the neo-Nazis got really mad about an article I'd written about immigration, and they were calling my office and threatening to kill me or rape my daughter or, you know, charming things like that. And so yeah, I'm gonna make that as public as I can. There was another example was, there's an organization that puts out blacklists of faculty working around Palestinian human rights. And they named a couple colleagues of mine who are utterly middle-of-the-road academics, you know, saying the most minimal things. I started a campaign that eventually got over 1,000 people named, demanding to be included on the blacklist, and documented how I'd in fact done a great deal more than any of my colleagues, and I was offended that after all of this hard work I wasn't. And I mean, it feels like a joke, but I believe this takes the power out of those things. Now, social media, oh gosh, it's complicated. Yeah, it's this, boy, when I started doing organizing, we had phone trees and made mailers, pieces of paper with envelopes and stuff. And you know, like any other tool, social media and all of the internet tools, they can be used well, and they can also distract you. And I mean, tools are tools. They depend on how they're used. We can pull together a teach-in or a protest in a day now that would have taken 3 weeks 30 years ago. So that's awesome. You can contact people so quickly. I can get news from activists all over the world daily. I actually do get a lot of news from Facebook because I know people, you know, working in Oaxaca who are covering things that are going on that aren't making it into the Post and the Times and whatnot. All of that's awesome. On the other hand, you know, there's the famous, well-known problems that people feel like, I clicked like 6 times, so I'm an organizer, or just the overload of all the news. I mean, it absolutely, there's days you wake up and you know, before you've had your coffee, you've seen 8 atrocities, and you know, doesn't make the day easy. I mean, and so, yeah, I mean, it's double-sided, but that's the nature of tools. They're all that way, right?
Right.
Yeah.
You've talked about what institutions and groups of people like St. John's can do in terms of first inward-looking, the inventory, then outward-looking, at least within our own community, sort of a 2-step process. But what else can we, in addition to that, as parishioners do with respect to assisting some of the organizations and movements that you've talked about?
Well, the main thing I want to say is that I'm not the one to tell you that. Go to the organizations themselves. Black Lives Matter DC is an extremely valuable. People ever hear about is Black Lives Matter is protesting police. Black Lives Matter DC works on gentrification, they work on hunger issues, they work on violence reduction in the community by methods other than calling the police, right? Lots and lots of police violence happens around domestic violence calls. BLM is putting together teams of people that can address domestic violence disputes in ways other than, they're doing this with extremely few resources, mostly east of the Anacostia. I bet they could use help. But, you know, the thing to do is to ask them. Ask them what they want help for. Not for me to tell you what you should do for them. And that's just one example. I mean, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of Black-led community groups in this city. Yeah, get on the phone, call them, ask them what they need. And partly also, I think it's really important. You know, this is a lesson I've felt like I've had to learn over and over again, is, right, leaving your ego where it is, right? So I now am very, very close to the Ferguson community, the people that were out there for a solid year, every single day protesting on the streets, facing tear gas and assaults. It took me about 2 weeks for anyone to talk to anyone in that community. And in those 2 weeks, I showed up for our first truth-telling event. And I didn't come in saying, I'm a professor, let me write things for you or teach you about stuff. I said, what do you need? And they said, oh, we actually need someone to help cook. I'm like, awesome, I can cook. I can peel potatoes and stuff, so I spent 2 days cooking. And then I spent a few days driving a couple sick kids around to, right? And after about a week and a half of being there, and I was making phone calls for press and stuff like that, 3 of the middle-aged ladies who had been the sort of the leaders of Ferguson Frontline came up and sat down and said, okay, we want to know who you are now. And we had a long talk. And at the end of it, they said, okay, well, we're having a meeting with the current leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and we want you to come. And, you know, we've kind of been friends since then. But the point is, you got to do some work first. And by contrast, a number of NGOs showed up at Ferguson in that year and really pissed the community off. Not sure if I can say this. Will I offend people if I say a bad word? I want to quote a young black activist from Ferguson who at one point, when we were explaining what we were doing with the Truth Telling Project and explaining that one of our principles was that if we ever paid anyone any money, that it would be someone from the community. That was an absolute rule. And she like perked up. She says, okay, that's good, I'll talk to you. And she said, because if I see one more white, bad word, come down here making 50 grand a year telling me how we should run our movement, I'm going to slap her upside the head. And I thought, that's fair, right? Anyway, I just throw that out there. It's something that I have to keep constantly reminding myself of. It's like, you know, do this work humbly. Do this work in the way that other people want you to do the work.
Thank you. Well, why don't we open it up to questions? I see a number of hands already, and we'll have the microphones. And please make sure to speak into the microphone before you ask your question, and for any follow-up, so we make sure we have it recorded. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark, for being here. This is fascinating and
Thank
wonderful. I know there's other parents and families in the room. I love your call to do that kind of work on yourself, and I certainly feel like me and my white husband can sit down and do that work together. Do you have you work with obviously college-age kids, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for how to do this work as a family or in the context of, you know, elementary or middle school-age children?
Absolutely. I mean, so for one thing, the Truth Telling Project resource is, in many cases, specifically designed for younger folks. So we have curricula there designed for K-12 education. One of the speakers is a guy named Gage Hendricks, who's like 11, I think, at the time. And he actually didn't have someone killed, but his mother was an organizer of the protests and was knocked down by police, tased like 15 times while on the ground, had pepper spray sprayed directly into her face. And then this was broadcast on YouTube because someone filmed it and put it up. And so he talks about what it feels like to watch your mom, get attacked on the street and maybe come close to dying because she protested, right? And so there's really young, and as I say, these friends of Mike's sisters and things are very, very young folks as well. And many of the resources that are up there are designed for younger groups. So that's one thing. There's actually all sorts of curricula out there now for people of all ages to start thinking about all these issues and things. And I want to say, kids can do stuff, right? I mean, look who's addressing environmental issues in this country right now. It's sure not people our age. So yeah, I think, you got to be a little, I would watch the things first to see, I don't, but yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for being here. Again, my name is Sari, and welcome to St. John's.
Thank you.
This is so inspiring and thought-provoking. And I just want to ask you for something, just some practical assistance here. So the diocese, which we're a part of, the Diocese of Washington, has started a conversation about looking and investigating what are the roots in our diocese that have benefited from slavery. At St. John's also, as Peter mentioned, we're uncovering some of that stuff. And traditionally, when we think about our involvement in these structures and these systems, we look all the way back 200 years to the roots that maybe have something to do with how we started. What you're talking about is white supremacy as something that is even till today, and over the course of the last 200 years, we have been actively benefiting from. So my question to you is, can you just rattle off 2 or 3 examples? Because if we were to say, we're in Bethesda, I could mention literally every single thing that we do benefits from this.
Yeah.
Can you maybe just make this a little bit more specific as to what you mean by?
Yeah. So right. You're in Bethesda. Look around you. Look at the kind of houses that are around you, the kind of wealth that's around you in this neighborhood. Obviously, churches run on donations. They run on the donations of the parishioners. I absolutely do not mean this as in any kind of an insult. It's just reality, right? Now go look at a church in my neighborhood in Southeast. It won't look the same. The houses around it do not look the same. This is very strongly correlated with race. I dare say this neighborhood is a lot whiter than Southeast DC, and a lot richer. So, those historical concentrations of wealth make a difference to what resources religious institutions have, right? It's just true, right? I bet all of your kids go to really good schools. I know the schools up in these parts. They're really good. That's one of the things about DC is DC has some amazing public schools. My daughter, because I lived as a faculty in residence for 3 years in Georgetown, went to which is Hardy Elementary School and Hyde Middle School in Georgetown. Both amazing schools. The school in the neighborhood where we live, when we moved there, didn't have windows. Or that is to say, didn't have glass in the windows. It had cardboard nailed up over the holes in the walls. And all of the other things that go along with that. What actually got that changed was some wealthier people moving into that neighborhood who had the sort of social capital to understand how to go harass city council members. My wife did some of this. To deal with these problems, because you grow up in certain social contexts, you understand how to do those things. You understand how to use the reins of power in ways that other people weren't raised to do. My wife also was on the board of a major tutoring program with a local school. That if kids at schools around here need tutoring, they don't need sort of the goodwill of other people. I'm sure they have those resources right there ready their hands. So I mean, I think all of those things feed into what resources you have here at this institution. It's great. There's nothing, I really, really don't like doing this work in a way that says you should feel guilty about that. It's not, you didn't ask for those resources, but you have them, so do the right thing with them, right? Use your powers for good. That's the overall rule.
This may be very complex, but, and it may just be economic. I just would like to hear what you think. But for example, in my lifetime, the gay community has moved up from inacceptance to acceptance, I feel, and it's wonderful. But why, with the African American community, are we still struggling with this so many years down the road? I just can't conceive of why there isn't a piggyback onto the other acceptance. I just don't get it.
Well, it's a complicated question. I mean, the really obvious thing to say, right, is that any family can end up with a gay kid. My family is not going to end up with a black kid. So that's a difference, right? And honestly, the organizing through the AIDS epidemic made it clear to people. That was the time of coming out. That was when everybody in America started realizing, oh shit, I have friends and family members and loved ones who are not heterosexual. There was nothing else similar that forced people in segregated communities to realize that they had friends and loved ones who are black, because they didn't. So that's one thing, is that those, and that whole, I mentioned that the dynamics of family wealth that transmit from generation to generation, that goes completely independent of sexuality. It doesn't go independent of race. So, I mean, that's one dimension of it. Beyond that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a historian, really. I don't have any sort of deep and detailed answer for you. I'm sure there's significantly other factors. I mean, I also think that I do think that capitalism or other systems of control work by pitting groups of people against one another, right? And this strategy, explicit strategies for this go back to the Romans, who they say if you want to defeat an uprising, you bring in some people that those guys hate to defeat the uprising so that they'll get mad at them and not at Rome. Every time major corporations brought in strike breakers for the first half of the 20th century, they brought in people of a different racial or ethnic group. These things play into the hands of, and you can't do that as well across, say, sexuality lines. It's like you can't make sure that all the strike breakers are gay or something. I mean, but we can sure as hell bring in a bunch of black Southerners into Appalachia to strike break the mine workers' strike, and then convince people that them's your enemy. And there's a long history of that in this country, and it's taken, and we gotta figure our way out of that stuff. Yeah.
I do have
Wait just a second.
Thank you. I do have a dimension or one answer to your question. It could be so something that I see a lot in the international development world, right? For example, the UN, the OECDs, you see largely Western, majority white countries telling developing, for example, African or Latin American countries, oh, this is how we believe you should do things and this is how things ought to be. And so there's this idea that has been spread around in the international world that the Western way is better and the Western way is more superior, and we have to tell, African countries, or we have to tell black people this is how, they need to do things and they always need help. And so I think that idea there's a reproduction of that idea, right, is, the black people are lesser than us and we need to help black people. We need to tell them how to do things. The Western way is better, the white way is better. I remember a couple of years ago where there were a lot of political uprisings in different African nations. And I remember people clearly saying, this is why you don't allow a black person rule. And I remember, I think Obama was the president here too, and just a whole bunch of things were happening with black leaders around the world, and it was, a matter of, this is why you don't let a black person rule. And so there's that idea of, inherently, people still have that idea of white people need to help black people and, tell black people how to do things. And, you put on your TV and you see, oh, this one African child has malaria and is hungry and we always have to help, Africans and black people. But it's like, well, yeah, there are hungry children in the US too. Hunger is not, it's not just, in Africa. So, but yeah, I think that's a dimension too.
That's super important, and I mean, anyone who hasn't should read Frantz Fanon. It's sort of the figure of talking about the way that these sort of international dimensions of imperialism get written into our psychology and our sense of this.
Read what?
Frantz Fanon. Fanon, F-A-N-O-N. His classic work is called The Wretched of the Earth. The Wretched of the Earth, and it sort of launched neo-colonial or post-colonial studies in some ways. But I was also another book I wanted to suggest specifically on the international development stuff. This is a book that's infuriating. It will bother you, but I think in a really good way. It's a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded Against the NGO Industrial Complex. And it precisely is it's local organizers from all different parts of the world talking about the ways that well-meaning, seriously well-meaning, resource-bringing Westerners go in and subvert the agenda of the local people and push them into things that they do not consider important and de-radicalize some of these movements and things of this sort. It's absolutely a super important dynamic.
We've got one last question right here.
Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm lucky enough to teach in one of those schools you talk, one of those close schools that are really fortunate, privileged, and whatnot in the high schools.
Yeah.
And it seems like one of the things that could radically change so much is the admissions process of schools like Georgetown. I mean, for example, I could mention, I have a BCC student over here. I could mention students who just are incredibly exceptional, like a filmmaker student. I won't even mention his name, and she'll know who I'm talking about. A filmmaker student who's filming in Nicaragua in his spare time and such. And I have no easy way to tell a Georgetown about this kid, and he won't get a look at Georgetown because of his grade point average or his SATs. And unless that changes, redistricting isn't going to change. And 5 years ago, we talked about the Common App and making sure kids could get their portfolios, but then colleges told us they're not going to look at it.
I agree. I mean, it's super important. Georgetown has taken a few steps in this regard. We've raised a lot of money for scholarships, which removes one dimension, but you're absolutely right. The kind of standards that are applied to admissions are part of the problem. I mean, I don't have anything to add. You're right. I agree, and we need to fight that, and we need to demand changes on all these fronts.
Well, thank you very much. I think you've planted a lot of seeds this morning and watered some that were already planted. So we really appreciate your being here. And thank you, Gary, for helping make this possible.
Gary.